What really makes a serial killer? I mean, is it something in their past, or is it something else entirely? Today, we're diving deep into the chilling case of Arthur Shawcross to explore that very question. We're going to look at the mind of a murderer and the incredible forensic tools that finally brought his reign of terror to an end. So let's start here on January 4th, 1990. For 2 long years, a dark shadow had been hanging over Rochester, New York. But on this day, with the whole city on edge, the news offered this tiny glimmer of hope, a potential break in a horrifying string of murders. So here's our game plan. First, we'll look at how fear completely took over an entire city. Then we'll uncover the killer who was hiding in plain sight the whole time. We're going to try to get inside his head. And then we'll check out the forensic toolkit that finally stopped him. And we'll wrap up with a really tough question. Can we ever see these kinds of crimes coming? All right, let's set the scene. We're in Rochester, New York, between 1988 and 1990. And this was a community just paralyzed by a series of unsolved and, honestly, increasingly terrifying murders. The horror really started to unfold in March of 1988. And as you can see from this timeline, the discoveries just started to stack up. The victims were all vulnerable women, their bodies left near the Genesee River. By the time June Cicero's body was found in January 1990, the city was in a full-blown panic, and the media was all over it. At first, these might have been seen as separate, tragic events. But pretty soon, the pattern became absolutely impossible to ignore. Same type of victim, same dumping grounds. The police suddenly realized they weren't just investigating individual murders, they were hunting for a serial killer. So, who was the man at the center of this whole storm? Well, the answer was about to shock the entire community right to its core. This is the horrifying truth investigators uncovered. Their suspect, Arthur Shawcross, wasn't some new threat. He was a convicted killer, a man who had already murdered 2 children back in 1972. He'd been paroled, released back into society, and now he was killing again. After his arrest, Shawcross's explanation for killing 13 women was this one chillingly simple statement. He wasn't sorry, he was just matter of fact. This bizarre justification just made the central mystery even deeper. Why? Why would he do this? So you have to ask, right? How does a person become a monster like this? The search for that answer led investigators and psychiatrists down a very dark and, as it turns out, highly controversial path. One theory comes up over and over in cases like these. If you want to understand the man, you have to first understand the child. It's this idea that the seeds of extreme violence are almost always planted in a childhood just filled with abuse and trauma. And this is where things get incredibly messy. Shawcross's entire defense was built on this idea of uncovering repressed memories of a horrible childhood. But when the person doing the remembering has every reason in the world to lie, how can you trust that those memories are real? So the defense brought in a psychiatrist, Dr. Dorothy Lewis, who used this controversial technique called forensic hypnosis. And here's what went down. At first, under hypnosis, Shawcross remembered a totally normal upbringing. But after Dr. Lewis kept probing and pushing, a whole new story suddenly emerged. These graphic, horrific memories of abuse from his mother that he had never, ever mentioned before. But the scientific community is deeply, deeply skeptical of this. And for good reason. Research shows hypnosis doesn't actually make your memories more accurate. It just makes you more confident about them, whether they're true or not. A person can still lie, and even worse, the hypnotist can accidentally plant the very memories they're looking for, essentially creating a story out of thin air. So, while the lawyers were in court debating the why, the investigators on the ground were using a completely different and way more concrete set of tools to figure out the how. A super important tool here is something called linkage analysis. It's how police connect the dots. They look past all the surface details of each crime to find a killer's unique psychological signature, the little rituals they repeat over and over. And in Shawcross's case, that signature helped prove one man was responsible for all of these deaths. And this leads to another really key forensic concept: scene staging. This is when a killer deliberately changes the crime scene to tell a fake story and throw investigators off their trail. A really famous example is a murderer who copied a scene from the movie American Beauty. It's a calculated move designed to send police looking in all the wrong places. So all of this, it leads us to the biggest, most difficult question of all. If we can find patterns like troubled childhoods in the pasts of killers like Shawcross, can we actually use those factors to stop future killers before they even start? Okay, just think about this number for a second. We're talking millions of people in the United States alone who have backgrounds that include things often linked to serial killers, like being adopted or suffering abuse as a child. Now, hold that huge number in your head and look at this one, the estimated number of actual known serial killers. It's incredibly, almost vanishingly small, just a few hundred. And that huge gap between those two numbers, that's the whole problem right there. It's called the false positive dilemma. For every one person with a troubled past who becomes a killer, there are literally millions with similar backgrounds who don't. The so-called warning signs are just way too common to predict something so incredibly rare. And so we're left with this really unsettling conclusion. The Shawcross case is fascinating, right? It gives us a look at the tools used to catch a killer and the theories we use to try and explain them. But it also reveals a pretty humbling truth. When it comes to predicting evil, we might not be nearly as far along as we'd like to think.